Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1371. Aleph, Shinai, and Aleph. And discussing the difference between Mishnah, and he's moved now over to Beraisa, which is also from the Tanoim. So it's so-called on the same level, the same teachers. So it's the same level as Mishnah, but as we are learning, Mishnah is Chagas, coming from Chagas of Atzilus, and Beraisa is Nihi, which also still needs explanation because isn't Talmud Nihi, as we learned earlier, but we'll get to that. So when you're talking about Mikrah was Chabad, but the Nihi of Chabad, because since Moichin of Atzilus, Chabad is such a high level, so the outer part of the higher level manifests in Asiya, as we discussed at length earlier when he was talking about Mikrah, which was on the pages 1365, 1366. Mishnah, however, he said, was the etzem of Chagas. So it's Chagas, it's a lower level, but you get the premius of the lower level. Beraisa, on the other hand, is Nihi. Why is it Nihi? Because Nihi is so-called the outer dimension of emotions. It's the method of expression, meaning what he called the klei hashpa, you can call the filters, the regulators, the valves, essentially the channels of how we transmit the midas of chesed, gvura, and teferes. And he explained the difference between netzach and hoid. The netzach is essentially the concealment within the mashpia itself, where he's regulating and making sure that it's not flowing at full intensity. And hoid is in the hashpa itself, the tzimtzum, to make sure it fits and is tailored to the recipient. That was briefly what he said, like the difference between the he pnimium and the he chitzenium. I'm just summing up what we read on page 1371. And he called it the kloyes yoyetzeis, which is like the kidneys, the advice or the counsel of the kidneys, which is the kidneys are also an outer dimension with their filters. Or k'maytrein bein, which are the testicles, which also regulate the flow of the seed, that it shouldn't be in the full intensity as it is in the moyach, and not in the same level of ruchnius, of dakus, same sublime level. And in addition to the tzimtzum, you also need to, he said, that we also have to make sure that the mashpia transmits the idea in a different paradigm, to the paradigm that fits the recipient. And he gave the example of Pnimis HaTeira. Like Pnimis HaTeira and Nigla, so the Nigla is the halacha of the Pnimis. They're both parts of they're the same reality. But in Nigla, it comes into terms, he says, halacha gashmis, which is a chochmah shebe'erech hamakabel. Where in Pnimis HaTeira, it can be a very spiritual and intangible or abstract level in the spheres or in the higher worlds. So the same thing is so he's bringing it in a paradigm that the makabel, someone, let's say, like in the case of Nigla, in this material world, you have a manifestation of it. The gam b'mishalim v'ezbeirim, with examples and explanations, that's middle of page 1371, and the parentheses is supposed to go after those words. And that's where we stopped. So now that we learned what netzach and hoid is, as far as klei hashpa, which is in contrast to chesed and gvura, which is the very core of the transmission. So when a person has chesed, it could be very intense chesed. Same thing with gvura, and you need netzach and hoid to regulate the flow, each doing their function like we discussed. So now he's going to go back to Beraisa, because that's what Beraisa is. If you remember, he said Beraisa is b'chinas yarchin, labar megufa b'chinas nehi. So now he's going to apply what we just learned to what is Beraisa, in contrast to Mishnah. Remember, Mishnah is Chagas, is like the flow from the source of Chagas, of the Midas, which is also a relationship with with existence, in contrast to Mikra, which comes from Chabad. But it's still, like he said, love, like a person who loves in a very intense way. And he is the way it regulates it and directs the flow toward the recipient. So now he's going to continue, and I'm going to continue reading. The line begins, Kamoi Kain HaBraises, on page 1371. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. So let's continue reading. Kamoi Kain HaBraises, so too it is with the Braises. The Braises is essentially statements. Just like a Mishnah is a series of a few halachas or statements from the Tanoim, a Beraisa is also, like Tana Rabbanu we learned. However, you won't find it in actual Mishnayos because the Beraisas were taught, so to speak, in a different environment, but by the same teachers. So, Kamoikena Beraisas, Ashanichelu b'Mishnah. What does that mean? They're encompassed in the Mishnah because the Gemara says, Beremes. So, in other words, whatever is in the Beraisa, you have in the Mishnah Beremes. You can't see it actually, that's why you need to spell it out. But it's hinted to there because those same teachers, when they taught the Mishnayos, they alluded to the things that would later be stated in the Braisas. Ukamesha Omar Ilfa, mi ike mide bebraisa delay preshitna la mimasnisa. Ilfa said, there's nothing in the Braisa that you can't resolve or you can't find rooted in a Mishnah. This is a Maimar Chazal. I believe it may be in Baba Mitzvah. I'm not sure which Gemara it is. Maybe Baba Mitzvah, but we could find it. Mi ike mide beberaisa. Mide is a matter, a subject, a topic. In the Beraisa, the lay peshitna means of the derive, that we draw or we interpret. Lo mi masnisa. Masnisa is a Mishnah. In Aramaic, masnisin. Masnisa is a Mishnah. So what do you see from this? That in addition to the Beraisas coming from the same teachers, that it actually is rooted in the Mishnah. So it's not a separate entity. It's not just a separate teaching. So Nihi comes from Chagas. So Beraisa comes from the Mishnah. However, in the Mishnah, it's only Beremes. So he's going to explain. So why is this called a Beraisa and this is called a Mishnah? Because the Sichlam. Why did the Tanoim say certain things about Beraisa? Because after the fact that the students, the Klei Makabel, the containers of the Makabel became diminished, the Sichlam, that their containers and their intelligence became diminished, meaning that they were not in the same level. Apparently, he's saying that the earlier stages by the Tanoim, their students were on a higher level. That's what it sounds like he's saying. But for some reason, remember, this is the beginning of Golus. I think we're going to learn about it later on the bottom of the page, about when the Beraisas and when the Mishnahs were said. But regardless, because their Kalim and their Seichel was diminished, so the teachers of the Mishnah had to interpret, had to break it down further. They had to spell it out. In other words, just like we talk about Talmud, that the Talmud spells out a lot more in the Mishnayos. Why? Because the next generations, just like we know, we need Rashi, we need, over the generations, as you go further down, we can't pick up that which is hinted to in the Mishnah. So a teacher will begin by teaching a Mishnah, a Tana would teach a Mishnah. As he sees the students need more explanation, he would spell it out and break it down, lefaret Yosher, in a Beraisa. That's what he's essentially saying. So in other words, the Beraisas really are included in the Mishnah, but not everybody can derive it from there. So the tzarich lefaret tzrichim lefaret Yosher. Well, kumoy, and he's explaining, kumoy lebal seichel gadol maspik le'akitzer. Like we're explaining it, like an example. A bal seichel gadol, someone who's a master, a great mind, it's enough maspik le. It suffices hakitzer. All you have to do is say something in a summed up way, in a summary, condensed, and he'll pick it up. And you don't need to break it into details. He'll get it. Like you see, people who have that level of intelligence or experience or wisdom, So you say something very short, they right away understand what you're saying. Rak lebal seichel cotton. They're adding at the bottom that because you have to say it means here. Someone that is not on that level of intelligence, someone is a lesser level of aptitude. Shema'atzme lo yoda, v'lo yovin es haprotim. On his own, he will not know, he will not perceive, and will not understand the details. So to him, tzrichim lefaret lehaprotim. There you need to spell it out more detail. And you see this all the time. You see people, depending on their level of understanding, this is not a critique or judgment, it's just a fact. Depends on the level of the makabel, of the recipient. So a Baal Seichel Gadol, you can say it in a short and brief way, but for another who doesn't have that level of intelligence or knowledge or wisdom, you have to spell it out in detail. And that's what the Beraisa does. Kamoy Kain. So that's the Kamoy. So Kamoy Kain, just as this example he just gave with the Baal Seichel, two different types of people. Kamoy Kain, Ribuy Aprotim, the Beraisas. The many details in the Beraisas, in these statements of the Beraisas, who mepnei nismaya to akelim. They're a result, they're due to the fact that the kelim became diminished of the students, of the recipients, and thus the breakdown to more details. So that's what Beraisa is. Similar to what we learned before, of what Netzach and Hoyd, what did Netzach and Hoyd do? Especially Hoyd. It breaks it into details that could be absorbed by the recipient. The truth is both Netzach and Hoyd, but when you break it down further, Hoyd is even more specific toward tailoring it toward the containers of the recipient. Okay, so that's how he explains what Beraisa is, what Beraisas are. Anybody has any questions? Because now he's going to reconcile something that jumps out based on what we learned earlier. But that's another section. So he's finished explaining what Beraisas are. There's more to be said. He's still going to continue with Beraisas for another page, the bottom of this page and the next page. But before we continue, anybody want to ask anything? Or clarify anything? Okay. So now arises a question.
How would different between Beraisa and Talmud?
We don't know yet because he didn't teach it. On the bottom of page 1372, he's going to explain Talmud. So Talmud as a whole deserves its own section. At the bottom of 1372, the new paragraph, he says, Omna ma Talmud, and he's going to explain the difference between Talmud and Beraisa and Mishnah. Obviously, Talmud is a whole other level, but let's wait till he explains it. He's going to explain it in detail. As a matter of fact, detail, when I say detail, I mean detail. It's going to be at least 5-6 pages, just of Talmud, if I recall correctly. Yeah. Especially, as I said before, that earlier from the Pri Etz Chaim, he said Talmud is Nehi. He said Chabad is Mikrah is Chabad of Atzilus, Mishnah is Chagas, and Talmud is Nehi. Now he said that Beraisa is Nehi. So clearly we need to explain the difference. But now he's going to begin by qualifying the next section by a question. I don't know if he puts it in a question form, but yeah, it is Vahagam. So he wants to understand now the Rebbe Rashab. Before we read on, let me just preface. Didn't we learn earlier that Mikrah is Nehi of Chabad? Why? Because Chabad itself is too intense. So you have to have the outer dimension of Chabad, is Nehi of Chabad, that's Mikrah, which ultimately manifests in Asiya, in the stories, in the simple stories of Chumash, of Torah Shebiksav, I should say, of the written Torah, of Mikrah, and in this and the basic mitzvahs without explanation, without details. So let me refer you exactly where he said that. He said that on page 1365. So he said that in all of them, Chabad, Chagas, Nihi, there's all three, encompass all three. And then he said, I just want to find the exact place where he says it. Oh, by the way, I see now, I'll point it out in a minute. Let me first just address this issue. So the bottom of page 1365, he said, Mikrah is mepchinas Chabad. But then he said, Ach mepnei shi memokim na'ila ma'id, ein yachol love bizgala shum asoga, only in stories and that. But then he said, I want to find the exact place where he said it's Nihi of Chabad. I think it's on page 1366. Let me just find the exact language. The end of the paragraph at the bottom of 1366. Yeah. It says Nihi of Chabad, in contrast to Mishnah, which is Chagas of Chagas. Rak b'chinas achrena shebepatzuv Chabad shu b'chinas Nihi, and b'chinas Asiya shebe Chabad u'bo ba'elam Asiya dafka. That's regarding Mikrah. So the question that Rebbe Rashab is addressing now, so what's the difference between the Nihi of Chabad, which is Mikrah? It's also brief. The brief mitzvahs and just stories. And Nihi of Chagas, which is Beraisa, which also brings it down to the recipient. So the answer is going to be, and we'll read it inside, one is that it's higher than details. Nihi of Chabad doesn't mean you're breaking it down into details for the recipient. There it's higher, and therefore the only way you can express it to the recipient is through stories and through brief through the mitzvahs themselves without explanations. Beraisa is the other way around. It's already coming down to the makabel in a seichel way. It's not higher than the makabel, but in the transmission itself, you need to break it down because the makabel's kelim are smaller. So Mishnah is already bringing halachas into the picture. How to do a mitzvah. In Mikrah, you don't know how to do the mitzvah. You're just getting just a short thing. So basically Mikrah is Nihi as in like just a very concentrated form, an essential level. Beraisa is the other way around. It's not an essential level. It's the level of Chagas, but you need to bring it down to the recipient so it comes into detail. That's essentially what he's going to explain. But before we go there, I just realized something. Remember, I had wondered, what does it mean on the 5th line of the page? So we said there that Netzach controls, restrains the flow, and the Hashpah is b'derech nitzachim. So now, looking back at page 1365, he actually adds something when he explains what means b'derech nitzachim. He says, and I didn't remember that, now I see it. He says like this, Tzachim v'heskim levad. There he said, Nihiu shabba b'derech nitzachim v'heskim b'levad. In other words, it's the chesed and gvura is the full intense flow. When you say something's coming to tzachim v'heskim levad, it means it's not the intense flow. It's just coming because heskim would mean determination. A determination. That's why you're doing it, not because of the flow, because you've made a decision to make it come down. The transmission should flow. So he calls it derech netzachim v'heskim b'levad. Oy shenihiu b'chinas hashpah b'poel. But I wanted to just focus on the netzach and so therefore, it's consistent with what we discussed, that it's not the very flow. I think someone had pointed out that it was more like a practical, effective way of communicating. But I think it's more than just effective. It means it's coming because you have determined, the mashpia is determined. It's not just coming from his natural chesed or his natural intelligence, which is just flowing unrestrained. Here, the netzach has caused it's been restrained, and he's refraining. He's refraining from the complete. He's somewhat controlling the flow, and the reason it's coming because it's a very, very deliberate determination, heskem and etzachen. That's why the flow is coming. I'm just adding because he said that there. I see he also brings nihi ashpah shalabar megufa bechein. Okay, it just the few lines in page 1365 help understand some of the words, some of the phrases here in 1371. But now let's go to the Vahagam that I just referred to. Vahagam, and though the Le'el be'inyan Mikrah Mishnah is boyer, like I just pointed out at the bottom of page 1366, we learned earlier, Mikrah Mishnah, the Mikrah lefishu b'chinas nihi l'chem ba b'kitzur. Since Mikrah is the nihi of Chabad, because the Chabad itself is too intense, so you only have the nihi, the outer dimension of Chabad. That's why it comes b'kitzur. That's why Mikrah, everything is short. You only hear about a mitzvah without details. Umailas Mishnah, and what is the advantage of Mishnah over Mikrah? Shenizgalu hapratim, is that the details are revealed. Mipnei Mishnah hi chagas, because Mishnah is chagas, and chagas reveals more details. So this seems to contradict, or at least it needs explanation. You just said that Beraisa is even more details than Mishnah. And you said Beraisa is Nehi. So what's the difference between the Nehi of Mikrah, the Kitzur of Mikrah, and the Kitz and actually, one second, let me just, one second. Let me rephrase the question. The question, what I said is accurate, but I think there's another point to it. You just said that Mishnah is Kitzur, because the Bas Seichel Gadol doesn't need so many details. So what's the difference between Mikrah and Mishnah and Beraisa, basically, is what he wants to understand here. Since we said Mikrah is also Kitzur because it's Nihi of Chabad. So he's going to distinguish like this now. Hine, this is like the response. That Hagam is though, and Hine now. The answer to that is Hine HaKitzur de Mikrah. The summary of Mikrah, the fact that Mikrah is in a very condensed form, Mikrah meaning the written Torah, we're talking now. Hu k'moy klal de nekuda, that's like a klal of a nekuda, that's like a concentrated idea in a nekuda, in just one point. She'ein bo izgalus hapratim klal. So like think of a seed. We're given this example, like Chachma, the seed of Chachma. Or a seed, or what is a seed? A seed has everything is in there, but it's concentrated, and you can't see, and there's no details. So it's due to its quality, its intensity. That's why it's a kitzur. It's not kitzur because you're diminishing it and breaking. Like let's say when you feed a child and you break like you said, pirurim. You feed a child and you break it down to crumbs. You spoon feed a child. Those small crumbs is not the nekudas haklal of Mikrah. That's the opposite, as we're going to learn momentarily. That you're breaking it down in order to spoon feed it. Mikrah is the other way around. Because of its quality, it only can be expressed. It's expressed in a very concentrated nekuda. L'mayla ma'apratim, basically. Ulagabe klal zeh, and compared to this concentrated klal. Remember, klal, we're talking now a concentrated point. Klal zeh, his galus apratim humayla. The details that you break down is a quality. One second. 1 minute. Well, I'm misunderstanding something. One second. Let me just read this again. Okay, yeah, fine. And compared to this klal, now, being that the klal is in a very condensed form, so you need, and you can't derive from that a mitzvah. When it says, let's say, the pasuk says that tefillin should be between the eyes, but you don't know where. Should it be here? Should it be here? Should it be here? And the same thing with other mitzvahs. The kitzur in Mikrah is taka concentrated and coming from a very high place, but you can't derive from that how to do a mitzvah. That's why you need Mishnah. So the Gabe Klauze, his Galus Aprotim Humayla, the details is a quality. Why is it a quality? Lefisha klal ubchinas katnus, because the klal is in a very concentrated, or you can say in a very limited state. We're talking now compared to the recipient. We're not talking about where it's coming from. But protim and bchinas gadlus, and therefore the protim is when a person like, so you could teach ben chumash lemikra, you could teach a 5-year-old chumash, written Torah. And they hear the story of Avram Avinu, story of Yitzchak. They learn about a mitzvah. But if you want to really know how to do the mitzvah, the elaboration, the godless, that's a godless that needs to be broken down into details. And that's what Mishnah does. Ukiyadua. And he's giving an example now from the two levels of Iggulim v'Yosher, Makif and Primi. Ukiyadua being Iggulim v'Yosher. Like we know about Iggulim and Yosher. Iggulim and Yosher is a Kabbalistic terminology for Sevav Kalam and Pnimi and Mamala Kalam. So Igul is a circle. Those are like the Makifim that surround. And Yosher means a line, is like the Kav, and divine energy that manifests in a Pnimizdika internal way. So which one is higher? So we're going to learn Iggulim are technically higher, but from a point of view of a recipient, the Yosher is far more accessible. So he says, the Iggulim mushabot b'chinas klolos levad. When you say ego, like you learn, let's say, an idea, and you're taught a big idea, but if it's still in a form of makif or ego, it's only klolos levad. So that's called hazeh b'chinas katnus. I know it sounds paradoxical, but it's katnus because at the end of the day, the recipient is only receiving a very overall picture, just the general picture, not the details. The Yosher shabab b'chinas protius, Yosher brings that energy down in details. Harizeh b'chinas gadlus. That's why it's called gadlus. However, you're going to see in a moment that Iggulim are rooted in a higher level. That's why they can only be expressed in a very diminished or concentrated form. Mishnah. An example for this is Mikra Mishnah. Mikra is like Iggulim, so you only get the general picture. And Mishnah is like Yosher that actually explains it into detail. Nevertheless, Mikra b'chinas nehisha be'elyon. End of the day, Mikra is the way it's expressed, correct. It's only concentrated as an eagle, a klolos, a klal. But it's still nihi, that klal, that katnus is the katnus as the outer dimension of a higher level than Mishnah. Nihi shebe'elyon. If you recall, on page 1367, he spoke relatively at length the difference between that. He said the klal. So I want to read this klal. It was a very important one. He said like this. The chetzenius elyon nishpal v'nimshach lamata yesem b'chinas pnimius tachten. So even though it's on a giluyim level, it's only the outer dimension. Mikra has less gilui than Mishnah, but at an atzmizdika level, on a core level, Mikra is coming from a much higher place. So he's saying Nihi shebe'elyon k'moyeggulim shein l'mayla ma'yesha. So though the makif in the level of giluyim, meaning as we receive it, it's a makif. It surrounds us. It transcends us. And Yosher we relate to a lot more, and it's much more internalized. However, fundamentally, Iggulim is a higher level than Yosher. That's exactly why it can't come into Pnimius, because it's too intense. Only the fact is that when it comes to Mikra, it's the chitzenius of the higher level, and Mishnah is the inner dimension of a lower level. So each one has something that the other doesn't have. If you're talking about Gilui, Mishnah is higher. What do you mean higher? Not higher in stature, but it's like he says, you're getting the Pnimius, but the Pnimius of a lower level. Mikra, you're getting the higher level, but only the chitzenius of it. And that's like Iggulim and Yosher. So that's the difference between the so-called the Mishnah, between Mikra and Mishnah. And there's a quality in when something is internalized. So you may be sitting, just to give an example, you could be sitting with a master teacher, a great mind, and what you pick up is very, very small ideas that you really can internalize, because it's beyond you. Then there's someone who's not such a great master, but what he teaches, everything he teaches, you understand. So which one would you prefer? The answer is you'd want both. And ultimately, you want to have the best of both worlds. But we're just talking about hypothetically, the beginning stage. So beginning stage, a student needs the second teacher. You need someone that's going to help you understand. Then you come to a point where you want to access something greater. So then you go to a greater, where you may not understand everything. It's like going to a higher class. You don't get it all, but in a certain way, you're exposed to something that's greater. So the truth is we need a balance. That's why we have both. That's why we have Mikra and Mishnah. We'll learn more about it in the next page, what each one does. But right now, basically, Pnimius has a Maila. Of course it has a Maila, because without Mishnayos, we would not be able to understand the Mikra. End of the day, Torah b'pirusha nitna, the Rambam writes. Torah needs pirush, commentary. And if you don't have the commentary of Torah Shabbal Peh, starting from Mishnah, you can't really understand Mikra properly. On the other hand, Mikra is the actual words that God said to Moshe. So obviously it's a higher level in its elokus, in its quality, it's far higher. But in Giluyim, in Pnimius, Mishnah is more accessible. Okay, so that covers the difference between the kitzur of Mikra and the kitzur of Mishnah. Remember we said Mishnah is kitzur compared to Beraisa. How about Beraisa? Where does Beraisa fit in here? She says, Aval haschalkus haprotim de Beraisa. But Beraisa, when it breaks down details, remember, Beraisa breaks it down even further than Mishnah does. So then what's the difference? He says, so haschalkus haprotim de Beraisa l'gaba haprotim de Mishnah compared to the details of Mishnah, ein b'zeh maila. That's not a quality. That's because the student is in a diminished state and you have to break the crumbs down. When you break up a piece of food into small crumbs for a child to eat, it's a mile for as far as the child can digest it, can eat it, consume it, and digest it. But from the point of view of the level of Gilui, that's only due to the fact that the recipient is in a smaller state, a more immature state, so he needs more details. So no, it's Mishnah is not because you need more details and the Mikra is not enough. There, because Mikra is a different level. It's a level of Iggulim. It's on an Atzmizdika level, and you don't have the pratim that you need. So it's a Maila that Mishnah is explaining the details of Mikra. Beraisa is in a way a chesed. Yes, it's a Maila for the recipient, but it's only due to the diminished recipient. That's why. That's what he seems to be saying. In other words, if you didn't have a diminished recipient, you wouldn't need Beraisa. But Mishnah you'd always need, because Mikra is too high for human beings to be able to contain, because it's essentially the level of Iggulim, like he says, Pnimius, it's a level of Elyon that's higher than Asogir, higher than comprehension. Mishnah is not higher than comprehension. Mishnah takes that which is higher than Seichel, which is Mikra, and puts it into Seichel that we could understand. Beraisa is taking that Seichel and breaking it down further for someone who may not be able to take all the details, who may not get the kitzur of the Mishnah but it's also details compared to Mikra. So basically, the pratim of Mishnah is a quality, and the pratim of Beraisa is due to the diminished state of the student. That's essentially what he says here in this section here. I should add, before I stop for questions, that in Eira Teira, that Tzemach Tzedek talks about this as well. He also qualifies, he asks the same question. Well, it's the same. The Rebbe Rashab is taking it from there. That he asks, what's the difference between Beraisa and Mikra regarding the Nehi? And the basis of what we learned here, but there it's very brief. We can look inside there, but to look there, it'll help us understand this as well. But I'm going to stop here now if anybody wants to ask anything. It's clear? Okay. So to sum up what we've learned, and as I said, he's still going to continue in the next paragraph with Beraisas. So to sum up, Beraisa is connected to Nehi, which is Labar Megufa, means outside of the very essential body where Guf would be here, the torso would be the heart, the upper part of the chest. And Beraisa is already so-called connected to the faculties and organs that really are bridge the very body of the person with the outside, like the yarchid, the kidneys, or he said the testicles. So these are already more extremities. And in Ruchnius, it's the way the hashpah of Chagas, of Mishnah, it becomes more accessible and breaks down into more details that the recipient can receive it, who may not be on the level that can understand the Mishnah. Mikra is a very different reality. Mikra comes from Chabad, what he said is connected to Keser. He didn't say Keser actually, but he said it's high l'mayla hasoga. He said that back on page where I quoted before, page 1376, 1367 rather. And therefore, the only thing we can derive from that is only the outer dimension, which is the Nehi of it. As a matter of fact, when you look at 1367, he actually spells it out. He says, if you remember, he also brings the Golgalta and Moicha, which is another way of saying Iggulim and Yosher. Golgalta, the skull, is like Makif, Iggulim. Moicha is Chochma Shebekeser. Golgalta is Atzmis HaKeser. So on that page, he also spoke about those two dimensions, which is very similar to Iggulim v'Yosher that we just learned here. It's a similar idea. So although Golgalta is a higher level, but you only can get the external part of it. That's why it's only a skull. Moicha is pnimius, is understanding something. And that's the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, like we said there, we learned back on page 1367. So the outer dimension of the higher level goes down further. Like you said about Eliyahu Hanavi, I'm just looking quickly if there's anything there that we can... Yeah. That's why the mitzvahs come down in Gashmias and Torah only comes down into Seichel.
I have a question.
And that's why mitzvahs are equal to all. 1 second. Yeah. Come on. On top of 1368, very clear. That the Mikra is Nehi Levad, Shachar Basiya, Mishnah is Chagas, Atzmi is Chagas. 1 minute. Atzmi is Chabad. Just give me a second. 1 minute. That's the words he used at the bottom of 1365. Okay, so and Beraisa, let me just conclude. Beraisa, on the other hand, is taking now what we already have begilui in the Mishnah, so it's already gotten into the world of Pnimius. In Pnimius, now you have to diminish it according to each recipient. So it's a very different. Beraisa is like breaking down the crumbs, going downwards. Mikrah is actually comes in a concentrated form because it's coming from such a high level. That's essentially what he said here. Okay, go ahead.
So my question is, since you went back there and talking about Chisonius of Chabad, which is Mikra, which comes in the form of Nihi, it's diminished, it's only just the surface of it, if you will. So taking a big step back, this is Torah Shebaksab, Mikra, and that's revealed, mamash. It's the word of God that's laid out for us in writing. And there's a panemius of it, though, that apparently he hasn't talked about it being accessible to us, per se. As far as I can see what we've read so far, the panemius of Mikra is something that's above us, I guess. So it seems like a little bit of a paradox. This is a revelation of God, of godliness, God's word, what he wants, his instructions, and yet the most important part of it, the panemius, is beyond us. It's a little bit of a paradox. Does anybody get the panemius? Is that what Chassidus is for? I mean, so it's a revelation, but in other words, he's holding back the best part from us. It's a revelation, but it's not really a revelation.
So firstly, as I said, we're still in the middle of the subject. So more clarity will come as we continue learning the next page, and the next few pages. We're going to talk about this a bit. You're going to see on page 1372, he talks about what we actually get from Mikra, why we need it, and so on. Secondly, he never said the words that Mikra is Pnimius. He said the word Mikra is Atzmius. So Pnimius actually is reserved here primarily for Mishnah, because Pnimius means it's internalized by us. Is there a Pnimius up there? Yes, there's a Pnimius, but the whole point of Mikra really is when you say a divine revelation, like when the Jews stood at Matan Torah, when they first heard Mikra, they heard the 10 Commandments, and then the rest of the Torah as it was taught to them. What they experienced primarily was not understanding. What they experienced was divine revelation. They experienced an awe. That's why it says actually every one of the 10 Commandments, their souls expired. So it wasn't internalized. It was very much like being elevated to a higher level of Elikus. Like I explained at length a few days ago about the interface. Mikra gives us a much more of a taste of God on God's terms. Mishnah and Talmud for sure is going to bring it down into ways that we can internalize it. So Mikra's role is not internalization. Even though you can learn Chumash with Rashi and commentary and understand Pshat, but its main thing, Mikra, is really a divine revelation aspect that does manifest in words. When you learn Mishnah, you start understanding it more. So basically, Mikra will give you more the divine, like Makif, like Iggulim, like we just said, more of a transcendent experience. Mishnah will make it more internalized because you can understand what the halacha is. What are you supposed to actually do? Like you'll say, fine, I heard the mitzvah, let's say, in God, I heard that God said that keep Shabbos, or put on tefillin, or keep kosher. And so the divine transcendent element I experienced, but what do I have to actually do? What do I do Friday night? There you're going to need Mishnah and even more Talmud to bring it down into actual an actual guidebook for how to live your life, aligned with what God wants.
Rashi's not Mikra.
Each one brings a different aspect to it. And now everything in Mishnah, of course, is based on Mikra. It's taken from this. So Mikra would be just let's call the tip of the iceberg of God's will and wisdom. And Mishnah begins to see the iceberg. You see more the details and you begin to internalize it. The importance of Mikra is it's giving you a taste, in a sense, almost the way God sees it. Obviously, it has words, and there is a pasuk. That's why you learn Chumash too. but it's not the same. When you learn Chumash, you derive from it like a Shulchan Aruch, a code of law of exactly how you're supposed to do any mitzvah. You just know the basis of it. So Mikrah's main role is transcendence of the divine within the Torah mitzvahs, and Mishnah and Beraisa and then Talmud is meant to bring it into internalized.
Thank you. That was a wonderful answer. Thank you.
Yeah, but we're going to learn more about it. I think in the next page he actually says that in Mikrah you actually nirgish b'zeha lakus. He says that word, kanira b'chush, that the written Torah you feel alakus, where in the Mishnah you feel more legal language. We know it's alakus, and we know it's one Torah, like we learned earlier about Pnimius and Chetzenis, remember Shifcha and so on. But that's why Mishnah is called Shifcha or Isasa, the wife. That's already bringing Torah into a level that is more practical, Berurim and so on. And you need both. Look, in the interface of Ayin Beis, we need both. We're going to need to have, we want to have a taste of godliness on God's terms, but we want it to be in a way that we can relate to it on our terms. And we're learning now how in Torah you have these dimensions. And they're going to be the three levels of the Eira Makabel: moonlight, the brightness of a stone, the luminous stone, and vision, as we'll see. That's where it really comes together in a very powerful way. But at the end of the day, it's all about the integration between the interface between God and existence. But now we're doing it through the lens of Torah, in contrast to when we go from the bottom up, when from our distress or from our darkness as we climb upward, as I pointed out.
Sure. It's wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah. So the next paragraph is going to continue about Beraisa, going to continue until the bottom of the page, actually Talmud. The middle of the page is going to start talking about Talmud. So we have like a half a page more approximately about Beraisa and Mishnah, and then we continue. So it's very methodical. You see, he's unpacking it, he's explaining it, and it's a whole new way of looking at Torah. Listen, this is, even though this is based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer and the Tzemach Tzedek and so on, but there's no question this elaboration is a whole new way of looking at the Torah that we learn every day. You know, you learn Chumash, you learn Gemara, Mishnah, Gemara. This is an unbelievable spiritual take on the different dimensions of study. I think I mentioned Simchas Torah is the epitome of Mikrah. That's why you dance. Hakofa comes from the word Iggulim. You make circles, Hakofa, because it's Iggulim. We're not learning Torah. We're dancing with a wrapped up Torah, and it's an equalizer. Everybody is equal, and we're dancing with it because we're dancing with the etzem of Torah. Then comes the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is to sit down and learn it. Now you want both, and both are necessary in Torah itself. So you could say Simchas Torah is the epitome of Mikrah, and the rest of the year when we learn Torah, it's more the Mishnah and the Talmud of Mikrah too, learning Mikrah, but the explanations and as it comes down into the Kelim of the Makabel. Okay, so